Welcome to the Contact in the Desert 2024 edition of Neon Galactic, Part 3. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. One role of UFO UAP conferences like Contact in the Desert is to encourage and attract the work of leaders in the field, folks who are on the vanguard of this research, whether through old-fashioned gumshoe investigation, visionary experience, scientific research, serendipitous sightings, or otherwise. The gatherings allow for ordinary attendees to hobnob with the brightest minds available in the various subjects covered, all while comfortably at leisure in one of the most beautiful places in the world, the desert of Southern California. It's a recipe for long and frank discussion, existential musings, and a collective sense of mission. How can we, as humans, access truths that are deeper and more profound than we're accustomed, than we're led to believe by those supposedly in the know? Two emerging leaders in this quest for truth are J. Christopher King of the Experiencer Group and Inquire Anomalous, and Kelly Chase, author of the UFO Rabbit Hole and host of a successful podcast by the same name. The two, along with Jordan Flowers, make up the core of Ontocalypse Productions, which premiered an in-progress documentary episode at this year's event, The Beyond, UFOs in a New Reality. Chase and King have been featured in several recent productions, as their knowledge of the phenomenon, their sense of the process, their deeper than average experience and analysis all make them some of the most exciting and important figures in the subject. One interesting aside, King and Chase mentioned to attendees at their premiere that their filming sessions were plagued by the phenomenon's technological gremlins who wrought mischief at times with cameras and batteries. The gremlins may well have followed them to our interview. One mic flat out refused to work, a fully charged battery died, and for some mysterious reason, the video quality of this interview seems grainier than the others. It could also be the lighting. This is a production of KEET-TV. Please enjoy and don't forget to like and subscribe. You guys' documentary first episode premiered. I want to talk a little bit about the process of how you guys got to the point of showing it at the event and when people can expect to be able to see it on Apple TV. Kelly, you want to start with that?
Sure, absolutely. So we've been working on the docuseries for a few months now. We actually kicked off shooting while we were out at the inaugural Soul Symposium out in Palo Alto in November, and we've kind of been shooting since, and we are now kind of in the final production schedule. And we were very excited to be able to show it in front of an audience, especially the kind of audience that you have here at Contact in the Desert, where you have, experiencers and people who are really familiar with the subject matter, so that you can get that really great feedback from people who are, close to what's really happening on the ground. And so we didn't sleep for like 6 weeks, and we put it all together to, it's basically be able to show kind of a sneak peek of the first episode this weekend, and it's been really gratifying to kind of get it in front of an audience and get that feedback, and it's been a wonderful experience.
Yeah. My question, and Jay, maybe you can start with this one, is how do you choose what to put in a documentary about UFOs? The subject is so massive, it goes in so many different directions. How do you figure out what's important for your viewers?
I think that's a great question, James. It's challenging, right? Because it is a wide field and there's a lot to cover, and so we went back and forth about how many episodes do we need to tell the stories we want to tell, like what are we going to address here. And we started off with kind of one roadmap to what the season was going to be. And then as we started down the road, it was kind of like Waze was just kidding, and took us on a whole other path, basically in some ways. And it was definitely like a little bit of a road less traveled situation with that, but I think it's absolutely for the best. Often, I was just leading an experiencer session here, and there are so many situations where people talk about how when you look into the phenomenon and really concentrate on it, that you kind of get put through a form of a journey, like it can be like a shamanic initiation, it could be a hero's journey situation, but there's a process that kind of takes hold, and sometimes this kind of like strange form of magic seems to take place,
Mm-hmm.
and that seems that could seem kind of silly to some people, but to other people, I think that it deeply resonates, and that was absolutely the case here, where it seemed like as soon as we hit the word go, and we hit the record button, then it was just like we were off on this wild kind of story of our lives that is in some ways that informed the documentary series, but it's not the documentary series, where we were still able to tell these stories that resonated from what we were going through during that time. Is that a fair way to say that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's the docuseries that you set out to make, and then and then there's the docuseries that you actually make. And I'm so grateful for that process, because I think ultimately the sort of emergent phenomenon that takes over when you're working creatively and collaboratively, and especially in kind of close proximity to the phenomenon, is, I think, wiser and better at this than we are. And that we ended up with something that is better than the thing that we set out to make. But it is hard, because it's such as you said, such a wide field.
Yeah.
And some of my very favorite parts ended up on the cutting room floor. And I think that's always kind of the heartbreak of the process. But creating something that is coherent and useful to a wider audience, I think, is the higher purpose we're serving here. And we're really happy with where it landed.
Yeah, and I guess as far as like the subject matter itself, we found certain experiencer stories that we really wanted to tell, and that kind of reflected well on each other and really pointed towards deeper truths, I guess. And there was an element where we definitely wanted to cover kind of how did we get so far into our culture and navigate so far away from this phenomenon and these deeper truths that ancient cultures and so many world cultures have never had a problem with.
It's been taken for granted forever, except now.
It's been accepted for so long until recently, and it's like we found ourselves in this kind of divorced mindset, almost as if we were all atheists towards strangeness, and the lands of the dead and the paranormal and what people have been seeing in the skies and in the water and even in their bedrooms for maybe since time began. Who knows, right? So we wanted to cover that, and then we wanted to kind of resolve with a note of why it's important for people to study this on their own and to find inspiration within the process and kind of go on their own journeys. And we hope to inspire people that way, because the grassroots efforts, the independent efforts, seem to bear so much more fruit than when we wait for somebody else to tell the stories that we need to tell.
Yeah, that's an important message that I'm hearing a lot this weekend, where don't wait on the government. I mean, we can do a lot of that work ourselves or, within our communities, and to wait for a government that probably faces or thinks it faces an existential threat from whatever the phenomenon might end up being, they're never going to, at least not the deeper truths, if those are indeed real.
Absolutely. And I feel like, obviously Jay and I have so much support and respect for the people who are fighting that battle in Washington. It's a hard battle. It's a dangerous battle. It's thankless work in a lot of ways. But there's this other part of the conversation where, in some ways, ufology itself has been subsumed by the disclosure narrative, where it's sort of become, all the entire conversation has sort of become centered on this narrative of disclosure. And we're really passionate about, trying to kind of save ufology from that because there's still something so much wider and so much bigger going on here that realistically the government is probably never going to acknowledge the full extent of what's going on.
Yeah, and if they do, they're sort of admitting to an ontological narrative, and people don't like that from the government anyway. I mean, it's like a kind of almost I don't want to say it's a religious conversation, but it's in that area of human experience, you know? So yeah, I think that is awesome that you guys are doing that. And I think that for my own interests, I started off with the ufological conversation, and then the whole world opens up, whether it's the occults and, Eastern traditions and all of that stuff, Hermeticism, and you find yourself finding all these ideas that you never, encountered before, and it really opens up your eyes. And I think more people need that in their lives, and in this culture especially. So good work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
When can people expect to see it on Apple TV? It's an independently produced film, so you guys have the rights to it, and you were talking about putting it on Apple TV. What's the timeline for that?
Yeah, so Apple TV and then I think eventually Amazon Prime after that.
Oh, cool.
Our goal is to get it out as quickly as possible because things seem to be moving very quickly this year, so we don't want to hold anything up. So,
and if you hold it up, then it'll be dated by the time it would come out, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we're hoping to have this delivered and live on Apple TV by, the end of August, beginning of September. But, long story short, the second that we're able to post it, we will, and everyone's going to hear about it. So.
Yeah, excellent.
Absolutely.
What would you say so far has been the most challenging aspect of making the film for you guys?
Oh gosh, that's a challenging question, and for a lot of different reasons. What's the most challenging? I think. What do you want to say, Kelly?
Well, I'll start here. I think, as a writer, this has been a huge challenge, and I'm the head writer on it, but Jay and I have really written this together, in many ways, and. Just trying to figure out how do we tell this story in 3 episodes in a way that is both accessible to a more general audience, but also, really doing justice to the subject matter itself. And that is a really challenging thing to do because there's almost no end to what we could have included in the first 3 episodes. And so, we have hours and hours and hours of interview footage with people, many of whom have been on your show. Mm-hmm. And you know how brilliant they are. And they're the kind of people that you just ask them a little question and you set them up and you let them talk for an hour and it's pure fire. And you're just like,
beautiful. Yeah.
Yes.
You don't want to cut any of it.
Right. And then I have to take 2 hours of James Madden just spitting pure genius and cut it down to 5 minutes. Yeah. And I think that doing that in a way that still captures the truth and the essence of what the speakers were trying to convey is a real challenge, and something that's faithful, and something that, like I said, with the audience we wanted to show it to here at Contact in the Desert, so that it's both relatable to a general audience, but when it comes to, actual experiencers and people who've been researching for this for decades, for it to also have the resonance of truth with them as well. And that's a really hard line to walk. And so we've been really deeply immersed in that creative process over the last few months and kind of sharing a headspace for months now, just trying to figure out how to make that happen. And I think we've found the sweet spot.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. I completely agree with everything Kelly just said. For sure.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
So now there's been you mentioned it a little bit, you wanted to have the experiencer story in the documentary. And I don't want to say there's a split or anything else, but when I had Whitley in here, I was talking to him about the Soul Conference. And he wasn't invited to speak. And he says that he was told by some of the organizers that if he had spoken, half the people would have left. And that seemed really tragic and sad to me because, to my mind, he's one of the most profound thinkers in the arena. So, can you talk a little bit about the importance of accommodating experiencer stories and what people in general ufology can do perhaps more productively to bring them into the conversation where they're not now? And you want to start with that, Jim?
Sure. Yeah, as far as Whitley goes, it's a challenge, and I on some levels I do understand the predicament from Gary and Peter's position.
Sure.
With Soul.
So do I.
From the academic framework, and essentially they're having a conversation that is more centered, frankly, towards the military. It just is. They can talk about this, that, or the other thing, but essentially, who actually shows up to a situation like that are typically military representatives, people that are like DC lobbyists, things like that, and a lot of contractors, people that work for companies that I don't even want to mention their names. And you know, there are very good reasons to be trying to engage with that side of things and navigate a position within academia to be able to kind of validate these situations for the wider public and be able to come up with responsible ways to fund and find avenues within academia, and that makes perfect sense. And there are also a lot of other stories to tell. And, you know, for example, Jeff Kripal down at Rice University, he doesn't need to have, you know, 100 people with advanced degrees in aeronautics to be down there at the Archives of the Impossible. Those aren't really the stories that Jeff is looking for and trying to tell and really like digging deep into with his doctoral students and what he's collecting at the Archives of the Impossible. But what he is collecting are a lot of Whitley's stories and a lot of the stories that people brought to Whitley. And so, you know, I can see that there's like a balance point there. And, you know, one of the sadder truths about this is that that frankly, people in DC in general, with my understanding, and especially military folks, they don't want to talk about abductions. Yeah. They don't want to talk about non-human intelligence showing up, and they don't want to talk about close contact cases. If they can, you know, rerouting through this whole like, oh, we saw something on a radar, it was 5 miles away. We have these metrics about how fast it was, things like that. You know, they can keep it to the vehicles, or they can keep it to, you know, trying to examine plasma fields or things like this, or what they think might be plasma fields, situations like this, or, you know, transmedium objects. But, you know, there's a situation where admitting to the idea that they don't have any control over when some of these non-human presences decide to show up, that they can show up whenever they want, and they even seem to have a mastery over time itself that we don't quite understand. And, you know, the laws of physics seem to be much more understood by some of these NHIs than us. And that's something that they're willing to admit to a degree, but not in terms of how it affects the citizens. Yeah. And so, you know, that is a sad fact in terms of what the stories the cases that Whitley can speak to. Mm-hmm. And I think that in many ways that shows a huge amount of cowardice and fear on the part of people that act as if they're incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I agree with that. And another aspect of kind of bringing these experience or stories to life that was really important to us is that, and, you know, you see this so much in the life of career of Whitley Strieber and of so many, you know, abductees and experiencers over the decades, where whenever somebody's telling their story of some of this sort of anomalous experience, they're immediately put on the defensive because these stories are so weird and challenging. And so we're suddenly in this position where every time you tell the story, you can't tell the story without then litigating it. Not just the story, but but the credibility and character of that person across the entire span of their life. Yeah. And let's be real, almost no one's life can hold up to that kind of scrutiny. Yeah. We're all human. And so we wanted to shift that narrative to where we're not trying to, instead of being on the defensive, being a little bit more on the offensive and saying, listen, these stories are really probably difficult for you to accept. But that doesn't mean that this person needs to explain their entire life to you. Instead, let's think about what might be going on with your view of reality, with like our consensus view of reality that isn't sufficient to grapple with these experiences that are actually extraordinarily common. They're a part of human experience. And so instead we're trying to do that, to offer people frameworks and models that can help them to process and integrate these stories, as opposed to constantly putting experiencers on trial.
Yeah. It's, can you talk a little bit about what the danger is for folks if they're not accommodated with their stories? These experiences can be violent, they can also be wonderful, they can basically, run the gamut. But if people aren't allowed to, air those and talk with other people about them, if that's what they feel like they need, there's a danger there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
In terms of the danger of...
To people personally for not having the ability to, reach out and share their experiences and have...
Absolutely. And there's a lot of danger when people do share their experiences. So being able to talk about how common this actually is, and being able to normalize the conversations, even among family structures and among loved ones, is incredibly important. Because, I can't identify the person, I can't even identify the circumstances, but there are many situations that I hear about regularly where people, when they're going through divorces and situations like that the other partner will try to take advantage of having spoken about these experiences to invalidate somebody's mental stability. In terms of who should have custody of children and situations like that. I've heard so many cases like that, and it's horrible. It's reprehensible, especially because in some of those situations, the partner knows that there's validity to what the person said, and they're just merely taking advantage of what they know to be the faults in consensus reality and the criminal justice system and the judicial system in general in our country and in other countries.
Yeah. Did you want to offer anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say, first of all, that I've been so pleased to be able to work with Jay on this project, because his work is so deeply involved with supporting experiencers through the experiencer group. And so that perspective has been really important, that we want to make sure that we're doing right by experiencers. And, I think the thing that we see over and over again is that in some ways there's nothing more corrosive to the human soul and the human psyche than isolation and being alone, and that these experiences can make people feel really alone. And while we're here this weekend at Contact in the Desert with so many experiencers, I was just out, by the pool talking to a bunch of people who are at this conference for the first time and at a UFO conference for the first time. And they were getting emotional, talking about, and I remember having this experience myself of being for the first time they're in a place where they don't have to self-censor, in a place where they can say what they actually mean, and where this thing that they've been carrying around inside of them, the craziest thing that ever happened to them, that immediately made them feel othered and isolated and they couldn't talk to the people closest to them, is suddenly they're just meeting people, grabbing coffee or, in one of the talks or at the bar, and having these profound connections and realizing that a complete stranger has also experienced this thing that they thought they were the only one. And so I think that we're so grateful to the experiencers who have worked with us on this project and are putting their story out there, because I think that the bravery that they're showing is going to have ripple effects out in the world and in the culture that we can't even anticipate, when people hear this thing and they're like, oh, I'm not alone. And that can literally save lives. And I don't think we're overstating it to say that.
No, I absolutely agree. I think that is an important part of what this is all about, hopefully. So one of the things I wanted to ask you guys about a little bit, and this is sort of a personal question, one of the debates that I've been hearing a lot and sort of goes back and forth, is that there are people who think, obviously ETs are coming from another planet somewhere and they're traveling vast distances over space and time to come visit us. And then there's another element who thinks they might be interdimensional, and then yet another element who thinks they might be spiritual, of that kind of, make and model. could you guys describe, if you're open and comfortable with it, what your own spiritual journey has been like, if you have one, considering your interest and involvement in the topic?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. An easy one, right? It's such an easy question. No, but I do love this question. I think that what we're dealing with is not something that's coming from far away. There may be aspects of that going on. I suspect that what's going on Earth and with humans is interesting to a lot of different kinds of intelligences, for whatever reason that might be. But more or less, I'm fairly convinced that the phenomenon is something local and omnipresent and something that's right here, and that what we're seeing is something that we haven't quite been set up to deal with. I've obviously been very heavily influenced by the work of our mutual friend, Dr. James Madden, with his Uber-Umwelt theory and hyperobjects, and I won't go into it because I can't articulate it as beautifully as he can. But, the overall idea is that, our senses only capture a certain percentage of what there is around us, and that there seems to be a much more complex ecology of intelligences that lay kind of right outside of our own kind of Platonic caves. Mm-hmm. And whatever this is something that I think that we're all going to have to level up a little bit in terms of our understanding of reality and in terms of, tapping into our innate human capacities and potential to start to grapple with. But, I don't think this is, aliens coming from I think there may be aliens coming from other planets.
Yes, and rather than
yes.
both. Yeah,
exactly.
Or whatever,
exactly.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, absolutely. As far as like the spiritual history and development for myself, I was born, and I was born. That's where it started.
Usually, that's where the story starts.
I was born into the Presbyterian Church. My grandfather and a great grandfather were both Presbyterian ministers. So was my stepfather, actually, and my mother. My mother became a Presbyterian minister when I was, about 5th grade or so. Yeah. And so the church played a significant role in my childhood. I spent a lot of time hanging out in church basements, playing hide and go seek, crawling under the pews, things like that, trying to find food in these giant weird kitchens, And and at the same time, I recognized that there was, as kind of an empathic person and somebody that, for whatever reason, maybe partially because when I was young, I lived in what people would consider a haunted house, several of them actually. Yeah. I was sensitive to some of these presences on a regular basis, and along with what Kelly's mentioning in terms of the Uber-Umwelt theory, in terms of, the limits of our perception and the idea that some experiencers could have an expanded sense of perception. If we're going to kind of recoin the phrase ESP, maybe an extended sense perception, as some people say. Yeah. I recognized that there was this other. Sometimes I would be in the church basement, and I would recognize that there would be other presences around. Yeah. And I wondered, well, why is that? Like, why are these presences down here instead of like where everybody collects to go talk to God, right? Yeah. And that fascinated me. And I think that kind of points to a wider structure that we're dealing with in culture at large, where people are ignoring the church basements of the world and not recognizing that so much of our collective psyche and so much of our deeper truths are hiding in the boxes and closets and rooms down below, where we tend to sing and pray and talk to each other about these stories. And so as I grew up, I recognized that we needed to pay more attention to those rooms in the basement.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah. It's an interesting thing too. We talk about the subject and all the different ways it can, sort of branch off into different, side topics that are philosophical or spiritual or whatever else. It seems like people can't get into this topic and go deep without doing some kind of work on themselves. Almost, it seems like it turns you back in. It's a mirror in a way that makes you look inward. When I was talking to Whitley the other day, he said that we were talking about the sense that he gets from the visitors, that there may be some sort of thing coming out, a culling of the herd ultimately, where there may be like a population, dynamic where it has to go downward because we reach max capacity or whatever. And his answer to my question about what people can do to sort of try to be on the surviving end of that cataclysm was basically live a well-examined life. What is it about ufology and all the other topics that sort of go along with it that make people examine themselves and the broader culture in that way? It seems to free people up to reconsider things that were long settled questions. And that's one of the aspects that really excites me about this topic, because people aren't willing to do that most of the time anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really is ultimately the phenomenon at its heart. And that's what I've come to understand so in my podcast, the UFO Rabbit Hole, I started it because I wanted to create kind of an on-ramp for people who were new to the subject to kind of get up to speed. And so, kind of a community has sprung up around it, and we have calls a few times a month. And what I find so fascinating is that the first couple of calls, people would be asking questions like, well, where are they coming from? And what is CE5? But very quickly, those calls changed in tenor as people got deeper and deeper into the subject. And the things that people wanted to talk about are, how do I integrate this into my life? Like, how do I be a good person with this knowledge? How do I give back? How do I help support the people who are going to be coming behind us, who are also going to go through this kind of, shaking of the personal Etch-a-Sketch that kind of leaves you back at the beginning and you've got to start over. And I've been so moved and inspired to see that happen again and again. And I think that ultimately, in examining the other through, the lens of non-human intelligence, that ultimately what we're confronted with is ourselves and who we want to be and what we want to do and how we want to live our lives. And in a lot of ways, I think that that's what a human being is, and that that's our natural default, and that, the culture that we live in and the context that we create for ourselves, that most of us aren't even aware of and we think is reality, isn't really reality. And that it's kind of divorcing us from our most innate nature, which is to seek and to question and to reach for something greater than ourselves. And that when people have an anomalous experience, or they recognize that the UFO phenomenon is real, or they have some sort of something happen in their life that causes them to fundamentally rethink things on a very basic level, that they suddenly snap out of it and they suddenly remember who they are and what they're about and why we're here, and that we're here to ask these bigger questions and to do these things together. And it's honestly such a humbling and beautiful thing to be a part of.
Yeah, agreed. I think one comment that I've heard, and one kind of reflection that I've heard from various experiencers over the years, when people often report when they're in communion or contact with what Willie terms as the visitors, asking questions and asking, what are you doing here? What's your job? Who are you? And it gives me goosebumps sometimes to think about how often I've heard a response that essentially is like, I'm like a gardener. And I often think about that in terms of what is that? Are we like bonsai trees? Is that what's happening here? What's going on? And I think that to kind of bring that around, you can examine your life, and you can find peace and you can find depth from being a gardener, from tilling lands and from planting and from doing that kind of work. I'm very aware of that. And, anybody that's plants or animals or raise children, that, there are life lessons that happen that. And we happen to exist in this framework where we love the mysteries, and the ritual of our personal rituals, or like my personal ritual in a way, is delving into those mysteries and tending to those mysteries and tending to the people that contain those mysteries and explore those mysteries. And so I think that there's a lot of ways that we look for examining our lives, and that we can find Pater with that. And for me, and probably for Kelly, and maybe for you, and for some other folks that will watch this later on, this is maybe just one of the more interesting ways that I can imagine doing it.
Amen to that. Part of my audience is from Humboldt County, California, which is the Redwood Forest, and it's a small community, rather sheltered. There are people there who've had anomalous experiences, and some of them have approached me, and I don't often know the best thing to tell them to do if they want support or community. So I was wondering if maybe, Jay, and you too, Kelly, if there's any advice you could offer for people who've had those types of experiences about what they can do to, matriculate those experiences into their lives, and then also to, have companionship within that.
Sure. There are groups like the Experiencer Group, which I'm the director of, that are private online communities that have kind of a culture based on some basic ground rules in terms of keeping people's accounts private. There are other support situations for people to be able to share their stories and compare notes. Yvonne Smith's Zero is an example of that.
Yeah.
That's been around for over 30 years now, their group. There are other groups out there as well. There are regional groups if you'd like to attend sessions in person. It does sometimes take a little bit of digging to find alternatives that would be in a local area. Kelly and I have talked many times about how important it could be for the future for there to be something that's a lot like AA.
Absolutely.
For this, and essentially that's part of what I do in the Experiencer Group. We have weekly sessions that are general support sessions out here at Contact in the Desert. Each day I've been running groups like this. Everybody sits in the circle.
Multiple times a day.
What's your name? Oh, my name's Sharon. Hi, Sharon. And people share their stories, and then I give some time for people to ask questions and give comments or words of support. And it's moving. It's deeply moving. It's not just and for some it's merely educational. For some it's validation. And for a lot of people, they say, "Oh my gosh, somebody else experienced something like this." Yeah. And I think that that's deeply important. And being able to take that resolve, and being able to take that peace of mind, and being able to walk into the world with it, and be able to share about their experiences, at least in more trusted situations with friends or with parents or loved ones, I think is critically important, so that we can see situations like we do in our docuseries, where the knowledge of this can be passed down through generations. Yeah. And so, there's often knowledge that we gain in oral tradition rather than our schools, right? Mm-hmm. And that's always been the case, whether it's our religion or personal beliefs or ethics and things like that. And maybe this falls into the same line for a little bit, where we need to kind of keep it to families and keep it in grassroots situations, because we have to keep that fire going, and not wait for this to be validated through these power structures.
Yeah, through the military or whatever else, which is again that hard spot. You wanted to offer anything on that?
Sure. I think all of those resources that Jay referenced are invaluable, and they're doing incredible work. I'd also say come to a conference if you're able to. Not everyone's able to, but they happen all over the country in different places and on different topics. Mm-hmm. And I know the first time I went to one, I was absolutely terrified. And I think a lot of us, even grown adults, have the sense that we're going to show up somewhere and it's going to be like the high school lunchroom, and you're not going to have anywhere to sit. And that's not how it is at all. You will not find a more warm group of people, and everyone is here seeking a connection that we don't necessarily get in our day-to-day lives. And so, if you've been thinking about it and you're like, oh, I'd have to go alone, I don't know if I can do that, just take the leap of faith, just show up. You'll run into people, you'll form friendships. I've only been going to conferences for 18 months, and I feel like I have this enormous beautiful extended family now that I am always so happy to see. And so, if you're feeling alone, like, don't be afraid to reach out and do some of these events, because you'll absolutely find your tribe very quickly.
Absolutely. And one other thing I'd like to mention is that, some people, they're deeply introverted people that something that feels like a support group is never going to be their vibe, because being in a circle of chairs is terrifying.
Yeah.
And that's understandable. Yeah. And sharing these stories with people you don't know could be terrifying. And even coming to a UFO conference for some people, or just entering a room filled with people that they don't know, could be scary. And it's also important to recognize that the great authors within this field can be wonderful friends as well, in terms of like looking at those stories and having a more deeply internal and personal relationship with their work can be very fruitful in terms of integrating their your own personal history into your life.
And when you're at these conferences, a lot of those authors are wide open and happy to shake your hand, and that sense of community is like powerful for people who have been following you from a distance, and to come in and meet your heroes maybe and get a little bit of a pat on the back is always nice. One of the things I respect about you two is your positivity, and it's consistent online and everywhere else. You mentioned earlier in our conversation that somebody was like, why would I want to go to UFO Twitter for a weekend? That's not what this is, but UFO Twitter is a fact. It is that thing that it is, and I enjoy it sometimes. I'm not on it as often as I probably should be to promote what I do, but I don't like it, so I don't. But my question to you is, how important is it to maintain that positivity, and what can we do to combat sort of the toxic troll culture that sort of follows it around?
Gosh, that's such a great question. I think that what I found really quickly with this work is that if you engage with that toxicity, that it makes it very difficult to do the work.
Yeah.
It's bad for you mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And also that the people who are engaged in that every single day are not people who are contributing to this field. It takes a lot of work to be an internet troll, and you don't have time to moonlight doing anything productive, from what I can tell.
Yeah.
And just to not let it's so easy on Twitter for kind of the loudest voices to dominate, and then for you to think that that's what this community is, and it's not. The experience that you have here is deeply loving and respectful, and it doesn't mean that we all necessarily agree with each other, but we can all sit down and have a drink or break bread or shake each other's hand and be respectful of one another. And I just think that in this work, it's really important. What you put out into the world is very important. We have these megaphones that we're able to put on, our every thought. And I think that, it's really important to me and to Jay and to, a lot of the people that we work with to be responsible with that and mindful about what it is that we're creating in the world. And, to not just leak your emotional poison all over the place when you're having a bad day. And so we really try to be disciplined about that. And I find that the people in the field whose work I most respect and who are being the most impactful do a lot of kind of daily hygiene on exactly that, on making sure that what they're putting out there is positive and useful and productive and respectful. And I think that that's a huge part of the game, and it makes your life better. So you really can't lose.
Yeah, absolutely. Like attracts like, and it's a lot easier to move through life if you have people around you that you respect and that respect you back, and have some positivity. I mean, I have a lot of challenging hours. I have whole challenging days. Kelly knows how hard we both worked on this project, and other people, other wonderful collaborators have worked for the last days and weeks and months to put this documentary series together. It's hard to stay positive sometimes when you're on incredibly a little amount of sleep.
Yeah.
You forget to eat. I forget to eat sometimes. This is a thing, and it can be challenging. And at the same time, there's a form of stewardship and service that is important to bring to a situation like this.
Yeah.
Because, at the end of the day, we need better representation, and there's so much, like with the docuseries, that why isn't there more smart TV out there, right? And when I watch TV, there's only so many shows. There's so many dystopian futures on television,
Right.
and there are so few utopian futures on television.
What's funny is that when you're at a hotel like this, you're confronted with it because you're hotel TV and cable, and it's like a whole world opens up that you're like, ew.
That's right, absolutely. And along those lines, it's like, every once in a while, when I just need to like turn off my brain, or if I just need to chill out and decompress and do some of that daily hygiene, sometimes it is like, this is kind of this is an admission here, but it's like, it's shows like Star Trek: The Next Generation, shows where it's like, they figured out money. They don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
They've got a unitard. Gosh, that seems smart. Things like this. They've got their utopian future. They're just exploring space for the benefit of humanity and for science and for knowledge and things like that. And there's real beauty to that. It's fascinating, and it's great, and it feels good. And those aren't simple stories. And there's this truism within fiction and within TV producing and within film that that the interesting stories that people want to hear are the ones that involved a lot of darkness and adversity, and at the same time, like, in talking about bringing positivity into things, we're still confronting darkness. We talk about it in almost every conversation. The darkness comes up, but that necessitates balance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Powerful
answer. Thank you. Last question. I'll let you guys go. You guys got things you need to do. How do you gauge progress? First off, from like you were saying, if we were outside looking at what's going on in Washington, there's that battle, and it's complicated, and it's nuanced, and it's in that language, the language of power, and it's not something that most people can understand or deal with. So for people outside of the Washington bubble or out in American communities, how can they contribute to progress toward a more accepting and curious future about the phenomenon and other things that sort of defy conventional explanation?
Yeah, I think that we need to stop waiting for permission from someone else, or from Washington, or from certain scientists or something like that, or legacy institutions to tell us that we're allowed to explore this. And that's happening. I think that that's probably the most exciting thing, is that it's happening. There is a massive grassroots movement going on right now, and that it is exploding exponentially from what I can tell. That there is a ripple effect from all of this, the work that we do, and the people who are brave enough to start telling their own stories and to start having these conversations with their family and friends. I've been nothing but inspired by how powerful this is, and that when it touches people, it transforms their lives, and that seems to be just something that grows. Because, like I said before, I think this is a really natural part of what it means to be human, and that the state of our culture right now and the status quo is very unnatural.
Yeah.
And we've all mistaken it for reality, or just the way that things are, but it's not the way that things are, and it's not the way that we are. And so I'm really inspired by what's happening. And when I think about what could continue to happen, and what I'm certain will continue to happen over the coming years and decades, I feel like there is this really heavy feeling in our country in particular, and I think around the world, that like things are just bad and they're going to just keep getting worse.
Yeah, so something fundamental has to change.
Right. But I don't have that feeling anymore after working in this community. I think that we have enormous reason to be hopeful, and that, humanity is in right now the process of coming to its own rescue. And I have a lot of optimism that can happen. And so I'm proud to play a very small part in that. And it's the most fulfilling work I could imagine.
I agree with that. And along those lines, I think a lot of people, whether they're interested in these topics or not, walk around in the world and recognize that there are a lot of things that are deeply wrong, that feel off, and in terms of cultural at large, and the things that we act like are important in popular culture. And that's not to say that let's all go be Amish or something like that, right? But there's a lot of emphasis on things that we don't need, or that promote imbalance, or that intentionally frustrate us, or intentionally prove emotionally challenging, things like that, and or that seem like arbitrary challenges almost that we don't need to have there to get through life. And why did we make it so hard to get through a day? How did we get to the point in culture where it became so hard to merely exist?
What's a credit score?
Yeah, why did they decide that had to happen? Why did they have to turn, somebody's credit? Why did they have to turn that into basketball or something like that, where there's a scoring system that a lot of what we're doing here, and what this field of anomalous studies in general is about, is trying to figure out some of these points where we found schism.
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of what we're addressing here. We talk about these mysteries, but it's also about finding these stressor points and recognizing that, maybe if we uncover some of these other things that we ignored for so long, maybe that'll help give us a place where we can have a re-emphasis or kind of diversify our interests and be able to reestablish things in a slightly different way, or maybe a very fundamentally different way over the course of generations, or even over the course of just our lives. Partially because we might be pushed into a situation like that anyway, because climate scientists, I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't know what the heck is going on.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people that think that our environment is shifting in a way that's going to be very problematic for us in the upcoming years. And I can't predict the future, so I don't know if that's completely accurate or not. But I find it worrying, right? And there are other situations where, if we're talking about non-human intelligences, what if we're confronted with that in a more public way? And what if we need to contend with that? And how much is that going to break people's brains to be confronted with some of that stuff, if all they've been doing is worrying about their credit score, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
So hopefully we can at least plant some seeds, and others can kind of join in, like yourself, in planting seeds to make those brains a little less broken if something like that occurs.
That's a great way to put it, and I think we can tend our own little bonsai trees, and hopefully get into a place where we can handle stuff like that. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. It's an absolute pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, James.
Thank you, James.
Yeah,
You did a great
guys.
work.
That's...